Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Cohen, Vice President of Research at Ardent Partners, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, AP Metrics That Matter in 2021. A little housekeeping details before we get into the presentation. Everyone will receive a copy of today's slides a little bit later this week, and those will come from our sponsor today, apexanalytix. A recording of the webinar will also be sent out after today, also by apexanalytix. And information on how to get a copy of the ebook, which is the subject of today's webinar, will be provided to you at the end of the presentation. So please make sure you stick around. I'm sure that's something that everyone's going to want to receive and take a look at. And then finally, we are reserving time at the end of today's presentation for your questions and answers, or questions, so that we may answer them. So please, you don't need to wait until the end to submit your questions. I'm sure everyone knows this by now. As you're listening in and have a question, please use the chat function or the question function in WebEx and ask your questions, and we'll try to get to all of them as quickly as possible. So with that, let's get started. A little bit about the agenda for today. We're going to talk a little about each of the companies presenting on the webinar today. And we've got a great lineup from Ardent Partners to Charles River to apexanalytix. So just a little bit of background so you have some context on who we are and how we fit into the space. And we have a good mix here of myself as an analyst, Gerard as an industry practitioner like yourselves on the line there with a great deal of experience we'll talk about in a second. And then Danny Thompson, who brings a wealth of knowledge from the vendor and solution provider side of the fence there. So we're going to go and go through the results of the survey that we conducted and talk about how we came up with the metrics, go through each of the different facets that we covered within the survey itself. And then we'll talk about the questions and answers that I know you're going to ask there. So, and after that, obviously, we'll provide you some information to contact Danny, Apex, or any of the presenters today. So, with that, let me get right into it with our presenters here. First, we're very fortunate to have Gerard Cardillo with us. Gerard brings a wealth of information to today's presentation. And what I really like about Gerard's background is that he's got a full kind of command of the whole procure-to-pay process. So he's traditionally, and through his career, been on the procurement side of the role, but more recently he's added AP. So he brings a perspective knowing what upstream and downstream and how they all work together with one another. Gerard is the executive director of category procurement for Charles River Labs, which is the world's largest pre-human clinical trial organization. Before that, he spent 9 years at AstraZeneca, where his last role was senior director, global lead of facilities and laboratory procurement. He has over 30 years experience in the supply chain, with almost 25 of those being in procurement. He's managed organizations with over $1 billion in annual spend, so he knows that of which he speaks, and he brings some great context to the metrics that we're going to be sharing today. Myself, I am Bob Cohen, as I said, and I am lead the ePayables practice at Ardent Partners. And ePayables covers everything from invoice automation, B2B payments, supplier network, supply chain finance, and myself, I've got over 20 years experience in the procure-to-pay space, both on the vendor side and the analyst side. So I bring kind of a unique perspective as well, an understanding not only of what solution providers are doing, but also what practitioners like yourself. And finally, Danny Thompson is SVP of Market and Product Strategy for apexanalytix. And Danny's responsible for defining, communicating, and leading the company's software product strategy and roadmap. He works closely with customers to ensure that each of the solutions meet their business objectives. And it's something that I've come to respect from apexanalytix and Danny, is that they actually do value the input from their customers extremely highly. I know a lot of organizations, say they do, but as I've worked with Apex over the years, they always have this close relationship with clients such as Gerard and many others. And that's only done by having the true symbiotic relationship. And so it's something that, I respect about apexanalytix. So with that, I'm going to turn this over for a moment or two to Danny to introduce Apex, and then he'll turn it over to Gerard to give a quick introduction on Charles River. Danny?
All right. Thanks, Bob, for that gracious introduction. as you mentioned, we work very closely with companies around the world. We have about 250, a little more than that, really large, the largest, most successful companies in the world that we're interacting with, really in every market segment. Together, those companies just last year protected about $6.4 trillion in spend, all combined, prevented or recovered over $3 billion in overpayments. We managed somewhere in the order of 32 million suppliers that we engaged in those interactions, and most directly in the supplier portal. Our clients were directly managing the vendor master data and relationships with over 4 million suppliers. Moving to the next slide, you can see our products really fall into 4 major product groups. What we've been doing for over 30 years globally is recovery audits. We perform more commercial AP recovery audits than any company in the world. And not only are we doing just your primary AP recovery audits, secondary recovery audits, contract compliance audits, pricing audits, retail merchandise audits, and others. The software that we use to do the AP duplicate audit work and other audit work is called First Strike, and we also sell that software to our clients to use as a preventive tool, and they are preventing about $2 billion in overpayments using this tool. The rule of thumb is 2 million in overpayments for every $1 billion in spend can be prevented with First Strike. Apex Portal is our more recent product where suppliers are fully managing their master data and also getting information about invoices and payments and accelerating payments, completing risk questionnaires inside that portal, and it's for 100% of our client suppliers. And to help automate that supplier onboarding activity, we created this solution called Smart VM that reaches out to 650 external data sources in real time, as well as our own proprietary database of suppliers to validate and enrich supplier data to make sure that the foundation of your P2P process is solid. So that's who Apex is. Gerard?
Well, thank you, Danny, and big thank you to Bob. As he was going through my introduction, I was thinking, wow, who is that guy? That's amazing. And he's like, oh, he's talking about me. So thanks again, Bob. So my name is Gerard Cardillo, and Charles River Labs is the world's largest contract research organization. We offer a full suite of services to the pharmaceutical and research industry, starting at basic research through discovery, safety assessment, clinical support, and manufacturing support. We've actually very quietly touched 85% of all drugs approved by the FDA in the past 2 years. 2020 was a kind of watershed year for us in that we had the great opportunity to do work for over 40 of our clients on COVID vaccines and therapies. You can go to the next slide. And I like to say that Charles River is the biggest company that you've never heard of. So we have 17,000 employees globally. We're in with over 90 sites in almost 25 countries. Annual sales has risen since I joined the organization back in the middle of 2017 from 1.8 billion to over 2.7 billion per year. No, it wasn't me that did that. And we are 50% of the market share in the verticals that we play in. We are exceptionally acquisitive, and we generally do 1 to 2 acquisitions per year. We did put a pause in 2020 due to COVID, but this is also reflected in our stock price, which has gone from about $100 at the beginning of COVID to now it's over $275 per share. So growing in leaps and bounds in both organically and through acquisition. So let me turn it back over to Danny.
Yeah, I think I'm going to take it from here, Gerard.
Okay,
But quite impressive growth. And you're right, the largest company, or one of the largest companies you've never heard about, and doing some good work there and helping us get through these difficult times, for sure. So thank you, and for all that your company does to help us kind of move on from 2020 into hopefully a much better 2021. A little bit about Ardent Partners, for those of you that may not know us. We are a research and advisory firm that focuses exclusively on the procure-to-pay space. We want to advance strategies that help practitioners like yourselves listening in today make better buying decisions, understand the technologies that are available, and really the subject of today's webinar and discussion is really try to understand what best-in-class performance looks like and understand what it takes to get there. And that's what we're going to try to accomplish here today. So a little about the demographics of the data that we're going to be looking at here. So this was a report or research study that we did, during 2021, early on in the COVID days, kind of a couple months into it. And so we're captured not only the performance, what was going on previously, but also some of the intentions and changes that were affecting organizations in the midst of the COVID crisis. So we had a couple of hundred respondents here. They came from a good cross section of the populace out there. So well represented from small, medium, and large organizations, a great representation across 25 different industry sectors that are there. And then also the job levels that we reach was also, quite varied, which is good, because if we just asked, one level, AP managers or VPs of finance, one question, we'd get, skewed results one way or the other. So it's a great blending across the board here. And so, with that, kind of, I want to bring up the first slide. But before I do, I was actually having a conversation this weekend with the director of accounts payable for a large $1 billion plus organization. And, he was actually had received the ebook from us, and he had some good feedback, for me. And, what he said was, this book represents everything that everybody is doing collectively. But, those of you listening in are probably at different stages of automation and different stages of maturity when it comes to measuring metrics. There's some basic metrics that companies start out with. And then as you kind of master those and start monitoring those, you kind of move on to the intermediary ones and the more advanced ones. So what we're showing here, where we talk about what the average results are versus the best in class, they're really to give you kind of a frame of reference to start your evaluation with. So if you haven't started, great, you're in the right place to start taking a look at what you need to do. And if you have started, realize there's always room for improvement. And then that kind of brings me back to my last thought here is we often get asked why you measure why you measure metrics, why we even bother to do this. And it kind of brings me back to a saying that I learned a long time ago, which is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't manage it, you can't improve it. And if you can't improve it, then you can't show what you're doing to the rest of the organization. So that's why we measure metrics. It's a great way to understand where we are, where we want to go, and what's possible. So with that, let's kind of jump right in here. So all but 3% of the respondents in our survey said that COVID impacted their accounts payable, with over a quarter of the respondents saying the impact was significant or extraordinary. How businesses paid their suppliers is one of the areas that COVID changed. Gerard, you've managed over $1 billion in spend. Charles River's extremely, active last year, as we saw on the previous slide. What's your perspective on supplier payments and how they might have been affected during the last year?
So I'm going to, pause for a second on the supplier payments and just say, in general, anybody who's gone through COVID and not applying that knowledge and those insights to all their strategies, their processes, their systems, et cetera, I think have their head in the sand. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to change everything, but this is a groundbreaking event, a paradigm shifting event that no one ever planned for. Now, that said, is that, from the supplier payment perspective, we went into 2020, much like many of the rest of the folks listening today, looking to improve our free cash flow through improved payment terms. So, and we were pushing hard on that, and we were very successful. Well, in COVID, we thought it best to take a step back, reassess that strategy, and we actually came out with a new strategy in that now we're stratifying our supply base. And if you're a large supplier with a big spend from us, we're going to continue to push on payment terms. Flip side is if you're a small supplier, maybe small spend with us as well, it's not going to be part of the agenda. And during COVID, we actually sought out suppliers that were struggling that we thought were important to our supply chain. And we actually paid in advance of payment terms so that we can get some money in the pipe and keep them afloat. So yeah, these are changing times for sure.
Hey, Danny, over to you. When you're talking to your customers, what are they saying about how they're paying their suppliers? What kind of changes are they seeing, if any?
Yeah, it kind of depends based on how COVID impacted the business. So in cases like Charles River, we're hearing where Charles River is a company who's very active and if anything maybe ramping up business during the crisis to help address the crisis. There, similarly, we've seen retailers, grocery stores, consumer packaged goods companies all behaving in a way that's very similar to what Gerard has described, where they're trying to pay some suppliers faster because they want to make sure that the wheels are greased on their supply chain so they can meet demand. But the other types of companies that have been hit hard, so we're talking about airlines, hospitality, maybe in-person entertainment type companies, they were looking for ways to extend working capital and work with their suppliers and supply chains to just collectively extend working capital in a way that made sense to everyone. So if you look at this as a whole, what we really found was a lot of collaboration between buying organizations and selling organizations around what really made sense for both parties given the situation. And we saw a lot less of one party or the other just really pushing an agenda on the other party. So collaboration was king.
Got it. And I think, you think about, when a crisis hits, what's the CFO's first reaction is to hold on to your cash. And I think Gerard mentioned that, the first reaction was, okay, let's hold on to our cash a little bit longer. But then when you took a deeper dive into your actually supply base and realized that there's different levels, there's different categories of suppliers, as Gerard said, and they have to segment those, and those that, are more in a better position and those that need the cash more so. So I think, what we saw here was the response was everyone wasn't holding on to cash. Actually, the change in the way businesses pay their suppliers, many of them actually look to speed up payments to maintain solvency, as Gerard said, and that's what our data showed as well when we kind of peeled back a little bit further on it. So kind of picking up, Danny, on what our survey showed in terms of early payment discount captured, Gerard said that, discount capture increases when you apply the right kind of mixed strategies. What did you see with your clients as far as discount capture and taking advantage of what was available to them?
Yeah, we've seen a lot, learned a lot in the past few years working with clients. Of course, we have tools that help them monitor discount capture and accelerate discount capture, as well as our some predictive analytics that we create around which suppliers are most likely to want to take early payments in exchange for a discount, and learn some really interesting things. Pardon me. First of all, the APR that you apply to a discount it's not a one size fits all world. Different supplier categories can accept different APRs, and so it's important to evaluate that. We've been using this cash discount likelihood score to predict which suppliers are willing to take discounts or not. And right now we've got an incredibly high, over 90% predictive accuracy rate around which suppliers are interested in taking discounts using this score. The second is some good news that you don't have to have an automated payment in place in order to get a supplier to accept an early payment. In fact, we found that every one of our clients has an equal to or higher adoption rate of early payments from check recipients as ACH recipients. And that's because you're still getting the check to someone faster by paying early versus paying late or on time. Of course, a faster cycle time to get to approval increases your discount opportunity. We see that your discount opportunity drops 70% on invoices entered after the 14th day. Let's see, extending payment terms drives better discounts. We've also seen companies that offer, they end up giving away early payments. And in certain cases, you might want to do that, but some companies just do it a lot more than you might expect. And then lastly, I would say you should open every possible channel for a supplier to take a discount. So as they're onboarding, offer them discount payment terms. Every time they have an invoice that's approved early, before the due date, offer them an opportunity to get paid early. And you can do that through your online inquiry systems, but you can also push out emails and text to suppliers to get early payments. And we found that if you do that, you can more than double your adoption of early payment discounts.
Yep. Good advice. And going back to what Gerard said, you need to categorize and segment your supply base and figure out which ones are more apt to offer discounts, take discounts, et cetera, because you want to maximize kind of the investment that you're making in AP and the time that you're spending. And it's also something that we see companies taking more advantage of early payment discounts, the more automated they are, the more they apply technology to their issues. Because as you said, there's less likelihood of getting a early payment discount if it takes you 10 or 20 or 30 days to have an invoice received and approved. So the faster you can automate the approval cycle, receive that invoice, the more likely you are to be in a position to take those early payment discounts as well. So kind of moving right along here, the perception of AP that we got back has actually risen for the third year in a row. We're now clearly above 50%. 3 years in a row, which we had never been before. So while the perception is rising and now it stands at about 60%, an increase of 5% over the previous year, there's still some challenges. Danny, what are some of the solutions to the challenges we see on the screen?
Yeah, so one challenge is just getting the invoice in the door, and we've seen that companies who are accepting paper invoices, they don't even get the invoice in the door until 10 or 12 days into the cycle. While if they have e-invoicing in place or even just emailed PDFs, they can get that invoice in the door in the first or second day after the invoice date, which is, automatically helps with cycle times. Now, once you've got the invoice, getting it through the approval cycles is really a matter of how much preparatory work did you do on the front end. Did you get the invoice? Did you get a purchase order arranged for that invoice? So it's essentially a pre-approved payment. Has the goods receipt been entered in a timely basis? But also, e-invoicing is a big help here. Is the supplier sending you an invoice in a format that's easily digestible, easily matched to the purchase order, and easily approved without requiring human interaction? So that whole e-invoicing piece, whether it's a file feed from the supplier or the supplier is going onto a website and flipping a purchase order, whatever you can do to get that data in an electronic format can accelerate invoice processing.
Okay, great. Hey, Gerard, let's ask you from your procurement perspective. can better connections and collaboration between AP and procurement help address some of the challenges we see on the screen and the many others that exist?
Absolutely. I think AP has done an amazing job advancing their brand, right? Raising their value to the organization. But, with the exception of the lack of respect / status in the organization, the three biggest things on the page can be improved through collaboration with procurement. So getting those upstream processes correct. Here at CRL, we've been digging into trying to, reduce blocked invoices. And we found that, only 5% are due to price. However, over 15% of our buyers' time are spent unblocking those invoices. It's a real drain on the organization, where they can be using that time for higher value interactions, and you're often pulling suppliers into it, you're pulling stakeholders into it. So it's a bigger sap on the organization than what it appears to be.
Got it. I'm gonna switch over to take the headset off, so hopefully you guys can hear me. Let's continue here. Another big challenge is holding AP back is the time spent handling supplier inquiries. Why is this such a challenge? Because almost a quarter of AP time is spent handling inquiries from suppliers, from internal personnel. Suppliers contact the business units wanting to know why they haven't been paid, why they got paid a certain amount. This is not efficient. If we can figure out a way to either enable the suppliers to service themselves through some type of portal, or more ideally is to eliminate the problem altogether, is really what we want to get to. And the challenges we talked about on the previous page, things taking too long, missing information, too much paper, all go into this challenge that we're talking about on the screen here right now. So suppliers and business units only contact AP when there's a problem. And so if we can mitigate those problems, find out where they're coming from, it's a huge win, because we can gain back a quarter of the time that AP is spending if we can eliminate these problems. So we can take them from doing tactical, manual, labor-intensive processes and get to a more strategic, value-adding use of time by AP staff. And which one do we want to do? Do we want AP to be running around chasing down answers? Or do we want AP to try to find out how to provide better information that can add value to the organization, make suppliers happier, et cetera? So next, manual checks are still a top B2B payment challenge. But second is a topic that's pretty, hot and, high on the list of things being discussed these days. And that's kind of managing vendor payments and banking details. Danny, talk to me a little bit about how banking validations are a big issue and what can be done about them.
Yeah, banking validations have been a real challenge for companies for many years now. The sort of tried and true method that companies used for many years kind of fell apart in 2020 due to COVID, and that was call a contact. If somebody's trying to make a change to a bank account, call your known contact at their office phone number and confirm that the bank account is being changed. But the problem is that with everyone moving to work from home, either those work phone numbers don't work anymore, or if you're calling someone's cell phone, you don't know if that person still works for the supplier organization. And so that's one challenge. A second challenge is that the fraudsters out there have gotten really sophisticated when it comes to changing bank accounts. They have been creative about just probing the AP help desk, calling a little bit here, a little bit there, gathering information along the way, so that when they're ready to strike and get a bank account number changed to a fraudulent bank account, they have all the information they need to sound like the supplier. And so a really cool innovation that's come in the last 18 months, it's been really changing the whole bank account validation paradigm, is real-time integration with the banks to validate the owner of a bank account. And one of our clients introduced this to us and asked us to build it into our supplier portal so that anytime a supplier is changing a bank account, the system reaches out in real time to a consortium of banks and confirms that the owner of the bank account is the supplier, that the bank account wasn't just opened, that it's got a positive balance, that the tax IDs match, so that the clients can have real confidence that the bank account is owned by the supplier and the payments are going in the right place. So that's been a really big innovation in the last year that we've seen in this space.
And if you look at on the right side of the screen here, the top B2B payment strategies for 2021, some of you may be wondering, number one there is pay when invoices are due or payments are late, 53%. It's a little bit maybe contrary to what we showed earlier with the change in payment to suppliers. But as Gerard said, you need to segment your supplier base. And so some suppliers that you may have been paying early, you're now paying on terms or paying late. And that's a conscious decision by many organizations out there. But it's just interesting as you look through these after the presentation here and kind of understand what you're doing there. Cash is definitely king, and organizations are figuring out how to manage the process, best for their organization. And as we discussed, sometimes it means paying suppliers early, and sometimes it means paying suppliers, at 30 days or late. Gerard, any comments on these findings? Anything jump out at you? Okay, Gerard,
There we go. Sorry about that. Yes, two things. So not sure if there's data on it, but my personal experience is there seems to have been an uptick in attempts of fraud during COVID because supply chains were so disrupted. And we found a number of suppliers that really weren't suppliers, that were trying to sell us critical goods and services. So putting that aside, I love these types of what used to be meetings, but now WebEx meetings, because it reminds us that it's not just you. So when I look at these strategies on the right-hand side of the page, wow, this is great. It reinforces that we're doing the right things and we're having the right conversations. Now, on top of that, as you look at those strategies, it just jumps off the page that there's no one panacea strategy that you're going to do and it's going to fix everything, right? So you have to attack this stuff on a broad front, and each one of these strategies is going to bring something back to the organization. So that's what my takeaway was, that it's certainly not a turnkey solution in any way. You're going to have to come at it from all different directions, and that's what brings results.
Yep, good point. Okay, let's take a look here at, e-invoicing has been around for 20 years. And when we describe e-invoicing, we're not really including in our numbers here PDF invoices that are sent by a supplier to a buying organization, and that buying organization then needs to hit the print key, and then takes that data and either scans it back into the system using some OCR technology or manually enters the information. When we're talking about suppliers that submit invoices electronically, we're talking about true electronic invoices that don't require any intervention. When the supplier sends them, they can be ingested and received automatically by the buying organization there. So what we saw was that 69% of suppliers are still sending invoices in a paper format. I mean, think about that for a second. In this day and age, that number is ludicrously high. Now, we're hopeful that one of the positive effects of COVID and work from home is that the number of suppliers that were resistant and reluctant to change and to go to e-invoicing is going to decrease significantly. And we've heard, stories about that. We've talked to different practitioners who are achieving some great levels of success when it comes to, I don't say forcing suppliers, but urging suppliers to move to electronic format. What we also saw was that, and remind you, this study closed in May of last year, so we're expecting to see a big change, as I mentioned, in next year's data. What we also saw was that best-in-class organizations were over 2 times more likely to be using e-invoicing than the rest of the respondents. And when I talk about best in class, and we'll have this on the next couple of slides here, best in class, as defined by Ardent, is the top 20% of all respondents achieving the best results. And so we talk about best in class, it's those top 20%, and the remaining 80% are where we come up with the other numbers from. So just so you know there. Now, electronic payments are also increasing. And, you know, this is a little bit better than what we saw with electronic invoices, but still has a long way to go. And once again, as we look at this in next year's survey, we expect this number to go up significantly. I can't tell you the number of stories I've heard from both suppliers and buying organizations being unable to process paper checks, and suppliers want to get paid. So if you want to get paid and you can't do a paper check, what's the option? It's being paid electronically. So we expect this number to go up significantly. We're making strides, but they're taking way too long. Paper checks are inefficient, costly, time-consuming, and as you know, Gerard mentioned, prone for fraud. If people are working from home, the incidents and the levels of fraud attempts have gone off the scale. And you know, the FBI has some statistics which showed fraud attempts in 2020, you know, being extremely elevated, because fraudsters love nothing than a catastrophe to try to take advantage of it. And paying with paper checks is not the best way to prevent fraud overall there. Gerard, we talked about the benefits of moving to electronic payments on the previous slide there. You kind of chimed into those. As more and more companies move to electronic payments, using your experience, you know, any suggestions and advice that you can provide to those companies that may not be using electronic B2B payments or may only be partially there?
Yeah, absolutely. I would certainly caution that, you know, the risk of fraud does not go away, right, with electronic payments, in that if you have a bad process, or if you're not validating the banking information, you've expedited the ability for somebody to defraud you. And an electronic payment is instantaneous. If it's sent to the wrong bank, to the wrong supplier, it can be really difficult to recover. But you know, it certainly is the right way to go, but just keep up your guard with regard to those potential fraudsters out there.
Good. Yeah, move a little bit quickly here. I know we have a lot of information. We want to get leave time for questions and answers there. It's always interesting to know what technology has been adopted and by whom. And you know, what we see here on the left-hand side of the screen is that some of the technologies that have been around for many years have received a little bit higher adoption rates than some of the ones on the right-hand side of there. Document scanning, most organizations have a scanner, some way to take a piece of paper and convert it to digital data there. But when it comes to some of the newer capabilities, they're not as well adopted. So, you know, when you're looking at this, remember, this is an average of all the respondents that we see here, and you think, oh, everyone's so far ahead of us. You know, we're so far behind the 8 ball if you're just starting out. You know, the reality is that's not the case. Some organizations have adopted the technology, and when they do adopt the technology, we do see a direct impact on the results and performance that they have. But if you look at the right-hand side here, some of these newer capabilities, the complete procure-to-pay solutions, the business payment networks, supplier networks, and portals, they've been around for a little while, but the adoption isn't there. So there is room for improvement. And when you look at this, you know, don't think like, oh, everyone else has it. It's really not the case. Companies have it. The ones that have it have achieved good results, but it's not across the board. So let's take a look at the cost to process a single invoice. You know, this year we came in at just under $11 per invoice. You know, while this is good, and certainly 10 years ago, this number was around $20 to process an invoice. So we're certainly making strides, but as you can see by the best in class here, they're able to process invoices at a cost that's 80% lower than everybody else. How do they do this? Once again, it's by applying technology here. So if you don't know what your cost to process an invoice is, I suggest, that you start taking a look at that, because the only way you're going to know where you are and how you can improve and if the work that you're doing is actually making impact is by measuring it. So 1089 is the cost to process an invoice across the board. Now, mind you, this is some that have automated and some that haven't. So it's a blended mix there. So if you're below that, great, congratulations. And if you're above that, there's a great opportunity and ways for you to improve. It takes 10 days on average to process an invoice. So that's, once again, down significantly from where we were 10 years ago. And it continues to trend in the right direction as more and more companies apply technology and we get this number down. But there's clearly room for improvement. And as you can see, best-in-class organizations are able to process invoices 74% faster. What does this mean? That invoice comes in, and the best-in-class are sitting in a position after 2 or 3 days, they have an approved invoice and now are ahead of the curve and can decide what do they do with that invoice. And when that invoice becomes approved and ready for payment, it actually turns into an asset for your organization. You can then analyze, do we pay this at term? Do we go back to the supplier and offer an early payment discount? So while it's critical to manage how long it takes to process an invoice, it's something, one of the key metrics, in addition with the cost to process an invoice, the time to process an invoice, is something that you should be looking at, at a minimum, and it's a great place to start. Invoice exceptions. Nearly 1 out of 4 invoices have an exception. And what's the problem with exceptions? We've talked about it before. It takes double or triplicate work, to get something done. So the invoice, it just can't be received, matches business rules, matches a PO, and routed around for approval. So 1 in 4 invoices have a problem. So what, when you take a look at this and combine it with $11 to process an invoice and the 10 days it takes to get that invoice approved, the fact that nearly 1 in 4 invoice is an exception, once again, there's clearly room for improvement here. And what you look at with invoice exception rate is another key metric in addition to cost and time, is once you measure it, then you can start figuring out how to tackle the problems. Why do you have exceptions occurring? Is it because there's a certain vendor, high volume vendor of invoices that you have that always has a problem? Then you can go back to that vendor and talk to them about correcting it. Is it a certain department within your organization that really isn't strict with its suppliers and allows things to get through and has missing information on there? Unless you start analyzing where the exceptions are coming from, they're never going to improve, and you're going to always end up having to spend time, kind of like Groundhog Day, which was last week or so, doing the same thing over and over and over again. And we know that doesn't make sense. Dan, what do you think of these statistics? Anything jump out at you?
Yeah, well, exceptions, I think it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. There's not only automation, but paving the way for an invoice to sell through and not trigger an exception through clear communication and good purchase order processes. A lot of exceptions get caused because procurement hasn't updated a purchase order, even though they've had a communication with the supplier about turning up the price or turning up the order volume or order quantity. So there, it's all about a 3-way communication, AP, procurement, and the supplier, to make sure that when an invoice arrives, it's going to sail through smoothly. Otherwise, it's back to what you said: analyze your exceptions and try to address them in an organized way.
Yep, kind of goes back to what I said earlier. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't manage it, you can't improve it. And why do you want to be dealing with the same problems time and time again, month after month? So invoice process straight through or touchless processing is really nirvana, if you will. That's when the supplier sends an invoice, it's received automatically, it matches against a PO or business rules, and then is ready. It is approved and ready for payment. That's what nirvana is. Currently, only about 1/3 of invoices across the board achieve that straight through processing rate or goal. And what we saw was that best-in-class organizations do a much better job because they apply more technology. They're more likely to be using e-invoicing and have a over 3 times higher straight through processing rate. That means that less human intervention, lower cost, less time to process an invoice, etc. You can see how everything is interrelated here. So the number of invoices linked to a PO, we saw that about 56% of invoices were matched to a PO. Why is that important? Once again, if you have an invoice that matches to a PO, you can automatically, if you have technology there and software, you can match that PO to the invoice. And if they match successfully, you know, within the tolerance that you set up, it can go straight through for processing. And I know it depends on your organization. Gerard's organization is more heavily PO based than some other organizations. But when you get to services organizations, you may say, you know, we don't have as many POs. You know, that's fine. There's technology exists to set up business rules to kind of mirror what that PO would do. You're expecting an invoice in from your cable supplier or your security supplier every month, and you know that it should be, you know, $100, give or take, you know, $5. You set up a business rule for that. If the invoice comes in and meets the criteria for that tolerance, it can be approved and then sent off for approval and ready for payment. So just because you don't have a PO, don't think that you can't achieve straight through processing. You most certainly can. There's no doubt the data can contribute to value. As we see in this chart here, 97% of best-in-class organizations view data and intelligence as important or critical attribute to their business. You know, and what do the best-in-class know that the rest of us don't know? They just realized that AP is sitting on a gold mine of information that's been untapped largely for years, and they're accessing it more so. So they're taking AP from a more tactical role where they're just processing paper and getting invoices approved. And I'm simplifying that. Yes, I know that, to one that's being more strategic, which is those things are happening automatically. They're eliminating the tactical tasks, and now they're taking the data and saying, okay, how do we take this data and extract information and knowledge we can share with the rest of the organization with that? And Gerard, talk to me a little bit. I know you've done this in your career. We talked about it before. You know, what are some of the examples that you have of leveraging data that AP has for benefit of the organization?
It's Bob, it's my lifeblood. You know, I can tell you what we should be paying for something. I can tell you what the deal says we should be paying, but AP tells us exactly what we did pay. And those data analytics drive my project agenda going into next year and what I need to attack. And also what I attacked last year, is it sticking? Am I getting the benefits of it? Or did I, you know, again, negotiate for a price A and I'm paying 2X on A? So the data that AP provides literally sets the roadmap for our success.
Got it. And Gerard, you guys are very progressive. Do you have any data scientists that are actually looking at AP data or within the AP organization?
We do. And not only do we have folks data mining that information, it through tools like Power BI, the metrics are available at the site level. And again, you saw that we have over 90 sites. So the AP data down to who the suppliers are, on-time payment at individual payment terms, DPO and DSO on the same chart, are all available at people's fingertips. So you can know exactly how you're doing versus the goal, which is a paradigm shifting event. Like you said, if you can't measure it, you can't report it, you can't fix it.
Yep. Great. I want to leave some time for the questions here. So I'm going to go through the next couple slides quickly here. You know, we asked AP, you know, what skills they thought were necessary for the future. So, you know, take a look at these after the presentation. As you're building your organization, as you're training your organization, this is what AP thinks it needs to be successful. More customer service, more collaboration, better information on fraud and compliance, and better knowledge, as Gerard pointed out, to the full P2P process is critical. Gig workers, those of you who don't know what gig workers are, or temporary workers, we're seeing many more being used by organizations. So you need to be prepared for them. And how does AP manage them? If you're not dealing with them, you may be. So just something to be aware of that's coming down. It's a change that we're seeing across the board here. And as you can see some of the stats on here. So something to be aware of and be prepared and be ahead of the curve. You don't want to be, you know, caught unaware. And finally here, before we get to the Q&A section, what does the future of accounts payable look like? We asked the survey respondents to kind of put on their virtual reality glasses, look into the crystal ball, and see what was needed for the future to be successful here. And, I think Gerard, may have shed a tear when he saw the number one answer was improved collaboration with key stakeholders across the organization, because we know he preaches that collaboration is critical to the organization. So it's great to see that, AP realizes that they're not, on an island by themselves. They're actually part of a larger organization that's here. And then on the right-hand side, how are they going to get there? With smarter systems that drive more intelligence, that, as Gerard mentioned, able to provide them with information, DPO, DSO, which is days payable outstanding or days sales outstanding, better information to run their organization. So with that, I'm going to bring on Helen, who's going to ask us some questions that have come in from you. And please, if you haven't asked a question, please do so now.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Danny and Gerard, for a wonderful presentation. We did receive a couple of questions, several questions, a couple of them on the topic of early payment discounts. And while the Q&A is running, you will see a poll. If you would be so kind as to answer that poll as we're going through the Q&A, I'd appreciate that. So the first question has to do with early payment discounts and optimizing those. This particular company already does a lot of work in terms of factoring program, but the question is, what would be your advice to plot a strategy that makes sense as a business case? How does data mining work to help here? So this would be early payment discounts for suppliers that are not in the factoring program. Danny and Gerard?
I guess I'll jump in with one point, and that is, suppliers aren't a monolith. They're not all the same. And even an individual supplier's need for early payment can vary based on business conditions. So we see a lot of companies, even some of the biggest companies in the world that you would never expect to take early payments because they have rich working capital. They sometimes do take early payments around fiscal year end or quarter end to try and dress up their balance sheets. And so a solution like factoring may not be appropriate for them. So what we have found is that you need a mix of early payment opportunities for people, and they need to be very intelligently marketed based on the business conditions and type of supplier that you might be dealing with. Private companies and public companies have different needs and different objectives around working capital as well.
If I could just add to that and say that the options need to be also different tools, right? So ghost cards, supply chain financing, et cetera. It can't be one size fits all, but look, we're a big company, and we take the early payment discounts as well.
Yeah, negotiated discounts, dynamic discounts, supplier initiated discounts, all of those, as well as third-party funding. In case your working capital gets a little bit tight, or your working capital conditions change, you need to either fund yourself or have a third party fund those early payments so that the suppliers aren't totally dependent on your working capital situation.
Thank you for that. Another question that came in is about the bank account validation capability. And the question is that available internationally? So Danny, I believe that'll be a question for you.
Yeah, so the level of bank account validation varies by country. In the US, India, and I believe it's Sweden, we have validation all the way down to the bank account owner level. In other countries of the world, we can validate that the bank account is valid, but we may not be able to tie it to the owner of the bank account. But we layer on validations that help provide confidence in that bank account, like tax ID validations, OFAC checking, and if someone's using our portal, we also do multi-factor authentication and you can demand other things like the person who's changing the bank account has to know the previous bank account. Things like that can provide security around the bank account.
Great. Question about metrics. What specific metrics do you find most useful? So a couple examples that this requester had were weighted average DPO, late versus on time versus early pay, and maybe getting a perspective from Gerard on this would be interesting on, best metrics.
Gee whiz, you asking me to pick out which is my favorite child. They're all exceptionally important. I love that when you could put DSO and DPO on the same page, and you can look at, how are we collecting our money and how are we paying out our money. It just screams volumes. In addition, they said, payment on time. You look at the payment on time for an invoice that's due in 10 days versus one that's due in 60 days or 75. You're going to see a stark difference in your payment on time. That educates people on why we don't pay people in 10 days, because it's just too hard to do. And it's really not worth it unless we get a discount. So the data changes the hearts and minds, one at a time.
And I would add to that, the metrics, or the child that you love most, as Gerard mentioned, kind of changes somewhat depending upon your level of sophistication and where you are in the process. When you're starting out, there's probably 5 or 6 or 7 key metrics that you want to measure. And then as you get those, a handle on those, then you want to start adding more in to the mix that are there. The level of sophistication is critical there. Days to approve an invoice, the cost to improve an invoice, the number of exceptions, things along those lines are some basic, table stakes, if you will. So if you're just starting out, you're listening on this call, and you haven't done anything, those are the ones that I would start with the ultimate goal of getting to where Gerard said, DSO and DPO, discounts taken, all those different things. So, another key metric is number of invoices in paper versus electronic format. I know talking to Gerard, they've already electronified or digitized, most of their invoices received some supplier. So it's something that they don't watch as closely because they've already kind of achieved the goal that's there. They just need to, be concerned when they bring on a new supplier. But the level or the different type of metrics will change as you get more mature and more sophistication.
Great, and one we'll end with, because we've just got a couple of minutes, actually a couple questions that are related. Were the statistics you presented, Bob, based solely on 2020? And since it was such a unique year, wouldn't it be better to have a cross-section? And then a related question is, how do you and Ardent think the changes brought about by the last year will change AP permanently?
Well, yes, the data we presented, we've done the survey for 15 years prior to this year. So we have a good indication of where things have been as compared to this past year. And as I mentioned numerous times, very interested to see the results from the next survey that we do and how things have changed when it comes to adoption of technology, when it comes to number of paper invoices, paper checks, things along those lines. So, I'm, anxiously awaiting that survey to go out so we can get the data back so we can see the changes that we've made. My gut, and I'd say it's more than, just a kind of my hunch, but, what I think has happened, and I've talked to many solution providers and practitioners over the past year, we do this on a regular basis, is the solution providers like Apex that I've spoken to, all of them, without exception, had record years. And that's because they offered a service that was desperately needed when work from home, took over, and organizations realized this. So what I think we're going to see is that COVID was the great automator, if you will. It helped organizations that could never successfully get a project approved, get them approved. It had more organizations who were fine doing things and never looked for an automation solution to do things differently. So I'm thinking that next year's results will see greater levels of automation across the board. The willingness of suppliers to submit invoices electronically will go up dramatically, and the number of B2B payments that we see being sent electronically or digitally will also be increased significantly. So definitely take a look at this year's results and then be on the lookout for our report next year. And our data is always available to practitioners at no charge. So, feel free to reach out to me or to Ardent Partners to look at our site, and through Apex, who has that data, that we're talking about today, to take a look at that and stay tuned. But I do think there's some good changes, and I think that COVID was a bad situation, obviously, that had a positive effect on many companies' AP departments and procurement departments.
So it sounds like look for the silver lining, right, Bob?
Without a doubt, there's a silver lining here. You got to be positive always.
Helen, if I could just add two real quick statements. One is in 2020, companies that were automated thrived, and those processes that were manual struggled. And then secondly, in the history of the world, nobody unautomated a process, right? So that talks about the future impact of all of the work that's been done in the last year around automation.
Great. Well, thank you all for the Q&A session. There are a number of questions that we didn't have time for, but they will be responded to after this webinar. Also, as Bob mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there will be materials made available to those who registered and participated. We thank you all for joining. We hope to see you at a future webinar, and everybody stay safe and have a good rest of the week.